Welcome and thank you for joining us today for the webinar. Honored to be joined by Dr. Stephanie Tikkanen of Ohio University. Dr. Tikkanen has been using Packback for a few semesters and has had the opportunity to use in the classes of various sizes. Today, she'll be sharing tips and best practices for implementing Packback and having engaging discussions in an 1,800 and 400 student course. In today's webinar, we will cover a little bit about what Packback is, and then we'll jump right into how she is using Packback in large, small, and medium courses. And then at the end, we'll have some time for questions. With that, take it away, Dr. Tikkanen.
All right. Hi, everyone. I feel like maybe the appropriate place to start would be to introduce myself. So I am an assistant professor in the School of Communication Studies here at Ohio University. I got my master's and my PhD in a combined program at the University of California, Santa Barbara. I recently, like most of my work, focuses on the way that we use mediated communication technology, like things like Packback or Facebook or Twitter, Instagram, to build and maintain our relationships. So you can see how this is a tool that's really exciting for me personally. I also teach classes in a variety of different sizes here at OU. So as Justin said, I've taught classes that were 18 people. I've taught classes that were 30 people, classes that are 100 people, and classes that were 400 people, which is a really wide span. A lot of the classes that I teach have to do with social media. So I teach an interpersonal communication and new technology course. I teach a nonverbal class. I teach an introduction to communication, and I also teach statistics, of all things. So today, I want to talk to you about some different ways to incorporate Packback into classes of different sizes, because I, like Justin said, have used it in 3 different classes that are very, very different environments. And to show you some ways that you can use it to help promote some discussion and help draw some connections between some of the stuff that you're talking about in class and some of the stuff that your students are talking about in the online setting. You can also use Packback to help build some meaningful engagement and student rapport, particularly in those very large classes when you don't get a chance to do that otherwise. So I'll talk a little bit about that as well. So I'll start off by explaining what Packback is. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, Packback is an AI-supported online discussion board platform. It's designed to help students really spark their curiosity, learn a little bit more about the subject, think more critically about it, and also improve their communication skills while they're at it. So as a communication professor, this is something that's really important to me. As a professor too, I really like how Packback saves me a lot of time while I'm at it as well. It's a really easy to use and very engaging discussion experience. And for professors, it goes through and it does a lot of the things in the background for me that I would have to do manually otherwise. So it goes through and using those AI tools, it can look for good questions and help coach the students on how to write better questions. It will sort things in ways that are easy for me to understand and to find things that I'm looking for. And it'll also help score them and assign something called curiosity points to make sure that we're getting high quality responses from the students. So in these different classes that I had, these 400 and 118 person classes, I have very different learning objectives. In this large class that I taught, it was 400 students, and it was an intro class, the fundamentals of human communication. It was largely non-majors, freshmen, and in a very, very big room. I had a couple TAs to help me out managing this, but one of the things I was really excited about with these students was helping them to understand some very basic communication concepts at a lot of different levels. So seeing how these things would actually play out in their own lives. I also wanted them to learn how to engage in better communication, which is hard to do in a class of 400 because I don't have a lot of options and opportunities for them to do oral communication, but they could learn better ways to enact the things that we were learning in class. I also had an ulterior motive in this class of trying to recruit new majors. So it was really important to me that I got them excited about the content of the class because I wanted them to join our major and think, hey, maybe the comm major is something for me. These are a little bit different than what I had to deal with in some of the smaller classes. So I also taught a class, the Communication and New Technology class. It's one of the ones that I'm most known for here on campus. And I taught it in a summer session where I had 18 students. And then I also taught it this fall. I'm teaching it right now, and I have 108 students in that class. So I've used Packback in both of those. Now, this is a more upper level course, and what I want from that is that the students should be doing some more critical thinking and really starting to reflect on how these things happen in their life. It's a lot more focused content, and I want them to be not just critically thinking about the topics, but also how these topics work together and how they synthesize across different weeks and across different concepts. As juniors and seniors in the course too, I want to not only improve their basic communication skills, but also their use of evidence in supporting their arguments, making sure that they are able to make claims and back them up, right? So there are certainly some challenges when it comes to reaching these goals. And in the larger class sizes, I know it can be really, really scary for students to speak up. Even logistically, without a microphone, I may not even be able to hear them if they speak up. It's a very large classroom. So it can be a little scary for students to speak up, which means it's hard for me to get to know them and really have them give me like a two-way interaction. It's also a fixed seating lecture hall. These chairs don't move. So it's really hard to promote interaction and engagement among the students because I can't say like, hey, turn around and talk to your neighbor because their seats don't turn. I can't do anything small group related, etc. I also have a lot of trouble with a class of 400 that I can't provide any individual feedback. I can't get to know the students' names necessarily. I just don't have that kind of cognitive capacity. But I also just don't get to have the sort of one-on-one conversations that I would like to have in a normal classroom. In a smaller class, though, it's also intimidating to speak up, but for a totally different reason, right? Because now instead of sort of just being an anonymous hand in this sea of 400 people, all of a sudden you know all of your classmates, and sometimes it gets a little scary to ask a question and you don't want to embarrass yourself in front of other people. So what I find is that sometimes the discussion in class is dominated by like 2 to 3 individuals, and some people are just shy, and I'm not hearing enough variety in the kinds of conversations that we're getting. The other issue that I really deal with in these classes, the students are really focused on what's going to be on the test. What's going to be on the test? I just want to know. And they're not necessarily thinking critically about the subject matter. They're not looking at connections across the different weeks and seeing how these things all play together, which is a really important aspect of my class. So all of these have been challenges for me in building meaningful student engagement and getting my students involved with me. So why did I choose to use Packback? For me, this was a space where I could have a little bit more personal interaction with my students and find a way to give them a little bit more individual attention than I can do in a class of 400 or even a class of 100, right? I was also able to get a little bit of deeper feedback from my students to help me gauge the understanding and see if they were getting these concepts, but also like what they were most interested in, what was resonating for them, what did they want to talk more about. It was a way where I could have the students engage in discussion that is just impossible in a fixed seating lecture hall. The people that sat in the front had just as much ability to talk to the people that were all the way in the back, if it was on Packback, that they could online, which we could never do in face-to-face. It was a great way to encourage some sort of group discussion and group debates, but also just to really get them excited about the subject, which for a social media class is pretty easy to do. They're already really excited about it. But it made them think a little bit more deeply. And for those that I was trying to recruit as majors, I wanted them thinking more deeply and reflecting on this and seeing why it was so exciting. So I want to talk for each of these a little bit about what I did to actually implement these in my classes. I'll talk about some of the things that worked for me, and I'll talk about some stuff that I would probably do differently in the future for each of them. So for the large courses, it was, like I said, a 400 student intro to comm course. And on Packback, what I did is I asked them to ask one question and answer two by the beginning of the week. So it was a Tuesday, Thursday class, and they had to get this done by Monday at midnight. So that gave me enough time to review some of what was going on before I started lecture on Tuesday. In that class, what I did was I tried to just respond to as many Packback posts as I could with the help of my TAs. So part of my TA's job description was to go in and respond to some of these, feature some, like some, just so they got to know a little bit more what was going on there too. I would go in and I would browse for themes. I would look to see, is there anything that like a lot of people are talking about, that this is something that they're really interested in? Especially looking at some of the auto-featured posts and seeing what Packback was noticing as something that was really important to my class. One of the things that I would do is I would take screenshots of particular questions and I would incorporate them into my lecture. So this served a couple of really cool purposes. One was to help encourage some student reflection. So I would do some like think, pair, share kinds of activities. I would also use these to segue into new topics. So if I saw that people were asking these questions, I'd be like, how convenient, we're going to be answering that kinds of a question today. And then I would also use that feedback to sort of steer some of the content. So if I noticed that a lot of people were really confused about a particular topic, or that a lot of people were asking the similar question, I'd say, okay, well, I wasn't going to do that, but now I'm going to. I want to help address the questions that you have. So you can see some examples. This is a post by Nick, and he said, if one is not an on-time person, would you hire them to work for your company? Why or why not? On time, in this case, deals with a cultural construct of like punctuality, whether or not people show up on time, or if they will get all the work done, but they'll do it sort of on their own time. And it was a really interesting question to me because it applied this class concept to something that was bigger, and it helped my students to sort of see what this would look like in the real world. So for this, I put the slide up and then I asked the students to like turn to a neighbor and sort of talk it out with each other for a little bit. I also had to give a lecture on public speaking, and I realized that most people don't really relish the idea of standing in front of 400 individuals every day, like someone that's weird over here. So I noticed that a lot of the students were asking questions about, how do I prepare for these kinds of speeches? What kinds of things can I do to calm myself down? How do you get over the nerves? Which to me seemed weird because, I mean, who gets nervous talking in front of 400 people? But I realized how important it was to them. And so what I actually did is I just did a little animation on the slide and put up all of these questions to show them, look, you are not alone in being scared about this, and I'm going to help coach you through it. So it was a really nice segue into a new topic and reflected a larger movement within the class and showed that I was listening. So one of the things that worked really well for me is this was a great way to tackle some of the constraints of a fixed seating lecture hall. I could kind of get around the fact that I couldn't put them in small groups. I couldn't have them discuss with people that weren't directly sitting next to them. And it helped those students to see some of their commonalities. In a classroom that big, you often have some trouble helping them see that they are part of a larger group, that they are feeling something that was similar to others. And in turn, that helped me shape some of my lecture content a little bit better, things that I hadn't necessarily thought about including. I was like, well, enough people are asking about this, I should encourage it. This was also a way for me to build a little bit more rapport with my students. So when I went in and I was answering them one-on-one, I was telling silly stories, I was sharing personal information, or linking them to something that was really cool that they might find interesting. And I could build a little bit more of a one-on-one relationship. Even if I didn't recognize their face, I knew their names, and that was helpful. It was also kind of nice when I would put their name up on the slide, they would see themselves and be like, oh, that was me. I just got recognized in this really big class for having a great question, which was always kind of fun. So some of the things that I might do differently if I were teaching another 400-person class and using Packback is I'd probably rely a little bit more heavily on some of the automated features. So this was my first time using Packback, and I really wanted to dive deep into the medium. But I think that I could probably rest back a little bit more and rely on some of the ways that it auto features, some of the things that it does to help sort the feed. So when I taught this class, they didn't have this function, but now that it exists, I would use it. There's a way to sort the feed so you can see like what are questions that don't have any answers that maybe need some attention, or what are some questions that are hot topics or undiscovered, like what's kind of going on. And I can get a better sense for what people in my class are really interested in by relying on some of these functions. I would also really encourage my students and my TAs and myself to rely on the space in the comments where you can include a citation and say, hey, look, this is a source if you want to check that out more. For this particular class, as I was trying to recruit majors and get them excited about the content, it'd be really cool to include other resources that they could check out right there in the question. I already know that you're interested in this topic. Here's some place to find some more, right? So then I switched from using Packback in a 400-person class to an 18-person class, which was a very, very big difference. So this was a summer course, and it was only, like I said, 18 students, but this was the communication and new technology class. So this was more upper division. The students were juniors and seniors. They were already comms majors for the most part. And every day in the class, because it was Tuesday, Thursday, was basically a week's worth of content. So what I did is I had them do 1 question and 2 answers right in the middle of the week. They had to get them in by Wednesday at midnight. That gave me time before Thursday to, review the questions and everything. But it was also a really unique way for them to either reflect on what we'd done in the last week or to sort of preview what we were doing in the next one. So some of the ways that I use this in class that I found to be really effective, we're using this as a basis for some of the in-class discussions. So each week, well, almost each week, I wouldn't do this every time, I would choose 4 questions from the list of all the questions that they had posted, and I would print them out on a piece of paper, and I would hand them to my 4 small groups in the class. I would ask them within their group to sort of discuss the question, and then they would present what they were talking about. And if it turned into a larger debate, awesome, we did that. So this usually took us maybe like 20 minutes at the beginning of class. It was a 3-hour class, so we had time to spare. I specifically focused on questions that either reviewed something that we had talked about in the previous discussion and, brought up a really thoughtful point from that, or that did a really nice job previewing something that we were going to be doing that day, or questions that asked for really specific examples and asked them to sort of think about how these things applied in their real lives. So some examples of questions. Lisa asked a question, do you think personal connection to an individual with a disorder is more influential to change the stigma than parasocial information? So I really liked this question because it brought in 2 different concepts that we had been talking about in the class, both with like social movements in online settings about, say, mental health, or parasocial information, which was like this connection to a celebrity. So she did a really nice job bringing in both concepts that we're doing, and she was citing articles that we did in the class and we had read for homework. Someone else asked, do you think social media is a good or bad thing in the context of politics and elections? And she said, this is my experience. What is yours? So one of the things that I would sometimes do was add some questions of my own to the bottom of it when I printed it out and said, like, I really want you to focus on this as we're doing this discussion or debate today. So I would say, what do you think? What are some pros and cons for both the candidates and for us as citizens? How can both parties benefit or be hurt by the use of social media in these interactions? So there were a lot of things that this did really nicely. It was a great way to connect some of those online and offline discussions, particularly for those students who were otherwise too shy to speak up in class. Because they knew too many people, they didn't want to be judged or something. So I was able to get them talking about things that they had discussed online and turn it into a larger discussion. It was also a great reflection point, both for the topics and the online communication process. I mean, we were talking about what it felt like to use technology for interpersonal communication purposes, and that's essentially what we were doing on Packback. So it was a little meta, but it worked out really nicely. It was a good way to recognize students for really great questions. I made a conscious effort to like switch up whose questions I featured so that everybody kind of got that little ego boost. And I also made a point to never give the question to a group that somebody in that group had asked. So it sparked new questions, new debates to help them also realize that they weren't just answering questions online from people that were already in their groups. We got to engage with a little bit more discussion. One of the things that worked really nice in this is we had a much greater diversity of topics. If there's only 18 students in the class, they can see what other people are posting about, and we started to see a little bit broader of a range. They weren't repeating the questions. So rather than seeing like, hey, there's a lot of people all focusing on this one issue, I got to see a much broader range and see like lots of different things that they were thinking about. I also learned from this that the timing of the post is really important. What I loved about this was the fact that it was kind of in the middle of the week and allowed them to both reflect on previous stuff and to preview some of the new things. If I were to do this again, I would still use it pretty regularly, but I don't know that I'd do it in every class period. I didn't do it in every class period last time, but I think that I really focused on doing it when there were good questions and they were meaningful to starting a discussion. So not just pushing it every time, but leaning back on it maybe once a week. Um, I might have perhaps pushed them to answer a couple more questions in that small of a class. I think they could have answered like 3 or 4 questions each week rather than just 2. And I think that would have also pushed them to maybe answer questions from people that they didn't already know in the offline. Like I saw the 2 friends in the class would always comment on each other's. And I'm like, well, okay, talk to other people. You can do that. And by requiring more questions and more answers, I think I could have done that. Another thing that didn't exist at that time when I used it, but Packback has added as a new feature, was this use of the counter and supporting points. I think I have a slide later that'll show you what that looks like, but it's a little bit more engaged and ask them to really support their arguments, which in an upper level course, they should be able to do. So that brings me to now. I am currently using this class, or using Packback in a class. It's the same class, the Communication and New Technology, but instead of being 18 people, it's 108. So it's a little different. We are situated in an active learning classroom, which is kind of cool. So it's not a fixed seating lecture hall. We actually are seated at tables of about 9 students. Every table has its own monitor that they can attach to a laptop, and they can use this as a space. So it's a little bit more flexible of a setting where students can chat a little bit more. I went back to doing 1 question and 2 answers at the beginning of the week because with 1 week's content, a lot of the stuff tied together really nicely. So it's kind of where I'm using it right now. So what I'm trying to do, just responding to as many as I can again. I do have a TA in this class as well, so I'm asking my TA to respond to stuff as well. I'm using it mostly right now to introduce new topics in lecture and say, hey, this was a really great question that somebody asked. Let's find a way to integrate it, and say, hey, this is something that we're doing this week, and you're on the right track. You're thinking good thoughts. We might look at some common questions that they had, or I'll introduce a question that, hey, we're going to actually address that today with our activity or with our lecture. Or I tried to pull up questions that were really poignant commentary on either controversial topics or current events, something that was going on right now, something that was very timely. I also introduced something in this one where I was incentivizing extra participation and a little bit of healthy competition by telling them that the top 5 scorers on curiosity points would get some extra credit in the class. And people have taken that quite seriously. So you'll see Alanis is like killing it right now. Adam there at the bottom, he's number 3. I am not too far behind him, but he likes to remind me every week that he's doing better than I am and is answering more questions. So I appreciate that they're taking it seriously, but they are using it against me too. So there are still some lessons that I'm learning. One of the struggles I've had in this class is trying to find a way to balance being a little bit more passive in the course and instead of letting it be in the background, and bringing it in a lot more actively in the class. I've got a lot of content that I like covering in this class. This is the first time I've used Packback and trying to figure out how to integrate it to also fit within the time frame of class that I need to. So it's been a little difficult to try and figure out ways that I can manage what it felt like with 400 people and what it felt like with 18 people in a 100-person class. I do still like finding ways to recognize people and, call them out and say, this was a great question, way to go. But also one of the things I'm working on a little bit more, and I think in a 100-person class, I can pull this off a little bit better than I can in a 400, is trying to find connections between the students' questions and looking at those larger conversations. When it's 100 people, I'm still able to get a lot of the diversity in the topics that I was able to get in that 18-person, but still there's some overlap, right? They're going to be asking similar questions because they're probably not seeing everybody's questions if they're not reading it super carefully. So it's kind of nice for me to be able to see some of the larger conversations, but I've also gone in and commented and said, hey, you should go check out Adam's post, or you should go check out Lisa's post. This was a really great way of showing them that there are other people in the class that are thinking in similar ways, and that conversation's already happening. They should go join that. Again, I would probably encourage the use of some of these new features like the counter and supporting points. So you can see what that looks like here. Somebody asked a question, could you make it through a day not using technology? Is it possible to live a normal life without an iPhone? This is actually a question that we ask quite a bit in the class. They write their midterm paper on something like this. So it's interesting to see how people responded and whether or not they were able to support what they said, if you agreed with them or not. So a question like this that introduces a debate, a value judgment of some way, people can respond either using that little red button with the counterpoints and say, I disagree with you and here's why, or with a supporting point, I totally agree with you and here's why. So I hope that in this discussion, you've learned a little bit about how you can incorporate Packback into classes of different sizes, and really use it as a way to support some of that discussion, whether that be both offline or online in the tool itself, and to draw some of the connections between those two spaces within the classroom environment. I also hope that you learned a little bit more about how to use Packback to build some meaningful engagement with those students, whether it is that they are able to get answers to questions that they're interested in, to learn a little bit more about the major, a little bit more about the topic, or if it's just that you find the one person in the class who starts making fun of you because you're not answering enough questions, right? But it's a way to sort of build some engagement, build some rapport, and get to know students in ways that I don't always have the opportunity to in large classes. So with that, I'd like to open it up to some questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Tikkanen. Really a pleasure to hear about your process. I think getting the window into kind of the iterative process of how you're learning and growing, like that's such a valuable thing for all of us. So really appreciate it.
Yeah.
And like you said, love to open it up to questions. So if you've got a question for Dr. Tikkanen, please feel free to hit the question mark icon at the top of your screen to submit a question, and then we'll read some of these off. First one we've got here. Do students find the one question and 2 answers per week too much work?
I don't think so. I think the bigger issue they have is remembering to do it, particularly when you assign it like maybe on a Sunday night for a class that starts Monday, Wednesday, Friday. They're not necessarily thinking about schoolwork at that point. So I've encouraged students to put a reminder on their phone. You can set a weekly reminder to say, hey, make sure that you do this. But I don't think it's too hard. If they've done the readings for the class, they've probably got a question, and they're encouraged to use brief questions. So, be concise, be to the point. It doesn't have to be super long, right? As long as it's a thoughtful question, they'll be fine. It's not hard. I don't think so.
The thing I found with talking to a lot of my professors is that this is a good way to get a baseline too, right? It's hard to go wrong with one question and 2 responses
Right.
in most contexts. And then,
Right.
if your students find it like it's too much work, talk to your experience manager. We've got a lot of professors using a different context, and we can come up with
Right. One strategy that I have actually done this semester is we do 2 midterms in the class before the final exam. So the week that they have a midterm, I don't actually assign them any Packback questions. And I say, like, you probably don't have any new content to be commenting on. I don't want these to just be a space for like reviewing for the class. That's better done in office hours. So that week they get to take it off, and it's their little reward. So that's one
there you go. Cool. We've got another question here from Warren McIntosh. Says, does Packback have a reminder utility to give students a gentle nudge that they haven't posted?
So Justin, I'm going to actually give that one to you because you probably know more about the basics of it.
Yeah, so we're really excited. We've rolled out a notifications tool this term. So right now it'll give you one of the things we're rolling out for the fall is the opportunity to kind of, if students are in Packback, they'll have a notification when they need to post. Now, as it stands, there's not an automated notification system, but definitely talk to your experience manager. Something I've worked on with a lot of.
One of the things too is Packback sends out like a weekly digest to the readers. And so anybody who's a member of the community gets this. And depending on when that goes out, it could sort of be a prompt for them. Oh, I'm not in this. That's because I didn't do anything yet. So that might be another way. I think that's usually sent after the fact, right, Justin?
It's sent on Fridays, and that'll show the best work from the previous week. And when
so it could just be like a reminder, hey, maybe you should do yours for this coming week. That would be a good idea.
Exactly.
And a lot of course management tools like Blackboard, you can set up weekly announcements in there too. So you just say, hey, go do your backpack.
Good, good.
Yeah.
Awesome. Let's see. We've got another one here. Does Packback plan to offer a mobile app based to meet students where they are? As far as creating a mobile app, I don't think that's on our roadmap specifically, but it was definitely created to be utilized on phones. So it's definitely a very mobile friendly application.
Yeah.
So opening up the website on your phone, I've got a professor who does all his Packback work at the gym. So get on the treadmill, open up his community, and scroll on through.
Does that actually require going to the gym? Because I don't know about that.
Exactly. That's more my philosophy.
Yeah.
Let's see. All right. It looks like unless anybody's got another question to offer up, it looks like we don't have any more today. Thanks for all the great questions. If anybody has a question we weren't able to get to, or like you'd like to connect to Stephanie after this webinar, you can follow the link in the chat to respond to a post from Stephanie in our global faculty community. Well, if you're not familiar with our global faculty community, it's a community on Packback designed for instructors to connect with each other. And not just about Packback, but for advice and tips and teaching strategies. So go check it out. And thanks everybody for joining today. We look forward to connecting with everyone again soon.